Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of the Incident Management Cafe. Today is a bit of a special episode. We have Dean Sheley with us. Dean has a long history of security, both experience both as a CISO, as a security architect. And today, Bob and I are just going to be picking his brain a little around the notion of security within IT as a whole and really where we're headed. So thanks for being here, Dean.
Yeah, Cam, Bob, thanks for having me today. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. So we know that we can't really have a conversation in IT or kick off any level of engagement without hearing security mentioned at least 5 times. So with that said, clearly it's a bit of a focus in the ecosystem. With your experience in the security space, as far as how security's evolved in the past couple of decades, we see a lot of cloud services kind of becoming pretty much commonplace with digital transformation. How has this digital transformation really allowed security processes to evolve within an IT organization?
Yeah, so Cam and Robert, I'm going to do something a little bit different on the podcast today, and I'm not going to come at it from like a marketing point of view. I'm not going to come at it from like a hype cycle point of view. I mean, I'm going to lay down the truth, right? Or what I perceive as the truth. Number one, from my experience, and then my friends kind of in the community, and I have a really close one with the Department of Homeland Security and CISA and so forth. So as we're kind of having like those behind the stage conversations before we come out, that's kind of what I want to share today. So your question was kind of around, what's changed over the last 20 years when it comes to security. And here's like the point blank answer for that. Identity is the new control plane. It's all about identity, period. Now that's a little bit hyperbolic. I mean, network is very important. It's critically important. But for like the last 20 years, we've been focusing on network security as a whole. And when you think about that drawing that I think it was Northrop or Boeing, the layers of security, and the one on the outside was kind of perimeter security, and then it goes in, and then data's at the middle. I think the problem with that is that the intention of that drawing was to show layers of security. And I think we as an industry took that as like, that's the order that we need to do things in, right? So we've kind of been stuck on network and perimeter for like 20 years. And nobody can tell you anything what's going on with the data, right? And I'll get into that a little bit later, but I'm like really passionate about that, because what we see today, largely, in the company that I work for, we do it's not our bread and butter, but we do a little bit of incident response. We're quite good at it and so forth. But what we see almost 100% of the time is that the bad guys aren't hacking in; they're just logging on. Right? So we as an industry really need to take care of that. And then lastly, I just say kind of data security. It's amazing how a lot of our customers and companies of all different sizes can tell you almost in real time what's going on with their network, and they can't tell you anything about their data, right? And when an incident occurs, your board of directors, the CEO, the insurance company, law enforcement, state agencies, if you're or national, if you're a regulated entity, they have one question. The conversation today is around incident response. They have one question. What happened to the data? They could really care less about anything else. I mean, that's a little hyperbolic too, but I'm just trying to answer here, Cam and Bob, that it's all about identities, and it's all about data going forward for the foreseeable future. I mean, decades.
Absolutely. And I kind of along the same vein there, with respect to what you said, right? We're working our way through that diagram outside in, and there hasn't been much of a focus on the data up until recently. Would you say that there is less of a focus on breaches in as a whole, right? If you are the bad guy, are you really looking to get into a physical location, or are you looking for someone that has either an easy password or really doesn't track where their logins are coming from?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you need to have physical security, absolutely. And again, depending on the organization, there might be some regulatory, statutory, requirements, fences, cameras, man traps. I mean, the whole thing. And, we won't get into the data center. I mean, everybody realizes that, but I mean, money is largely digital these days, right? So you're going to siphon money off. Maybe it's, student loans that are redirected, or, home mortgage, or you're purchasing a vehicle or whatever. Those get, directed to a bank in the middle of nowhere. Then that's transferred up until Bitcoin, immediately. And then by the time you get to that bank, it's gone. I would also say that, again, data is the gold, right? They're going to lock that up. They're going to encrypt it. They're going to, hold you, for ransom or extortion or whatever. And you're going to pay that again in Bitcoin, and, boom, it's gone. There's no really, money laundering there. So, the bad guys are largely, not completely, but largely financially driven, right? They do these crimes in order to make money. The data is the money. They're not going to steal your network. They're not going to steal your, any type of infrastructure, your compute, your, this, that, or whatever. It's all about the data. Again, back to those layered controls. All of those layered controls are there. Why? To protect data. In the path to that data, the number of hops can be really short, right? They get in through email, they infect an end user machine. That end user machine can talk out usually, and then all of that incoming traffic is then allowed. They have a persistent connection to a file server, like a H drive or a T drive or whatever, and then it's also a developer's machine, so they have a persistent connection to the Oracle or the SQL database. And boom, that data is gone.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like 2 or 3 hops. But everybody is focused on, the bright, shiny, blinky thing that's the hype cycle and whatever. I mean, I've got all of this exercise equipment in my basement, right? Because I buy into the fitness hype cycle, but there's like laundry and clothes hanging on it, right? When maybe I should just eat right and do push-ups. It's in these conversations with Homeland Security and stuff. It's like, do the simple stuff, do the operations, focus on what really matters. That's what makes the difference, not the blinky shining thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dean, I got a quick question, a follow-up to what you just said. So I mean, my background is as a developer and architect. So I know that, I mean, the bottom line is, if you don't want it to be, 20 years ago, the way of thinking was, if you want to keep it secure, don't put it on the internet, don't give access. But how is working remote, how is that changing things? Is that increasing the risk somehow? Because what you're talking about is more insider stuff, right? People that have access to tools that might be behind a firewall.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's exactly it, Bob. And I promise that I'm going to change the subject to other things, but this kind of segues backwards into absolutely what we were talking about. I mean, the network security, and hey, network security is critically important because we're always going to have stuff on-prem, and it's good to have the firewall and the IPS, IDS, and all that stuff there to protect it. But with a lot of us working at home and a lot of our resources in the cloud, again, that perimeter isn't as closely or hardly defined as it was in the past. So again, identity of the person, identity of the device, strong authentication, authorization, kind of this zero trust type of methodology where you remember the last 20 years we were kind of like trust but verify. Now we're in this world of don't trust and continuously verify, largely based on, identity of the person, the device, and the conditional access control and all of those things that come into place. Then you kind of get into the network security after that. But, data, again, is critically important to access control that. Maybe you want some type of DLP, so data can't be saved or data can't be sent out, unless it's authorized and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. So one kind of question that I have, I want to narrow our focus a little bit more on the managed services space, right?
Yeah.
So with the advent of security, yeah, if you're a Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 even company, you probably have some level of an internal SOC or an internal security team. With that said, though, your mom and pop retailer, or potentially the cupcake shop around the corner that's got a website, or even a local municipality, a police station, whatever that is. I see that a lot of security operations are being outsourced to managed service providers. So can you talk a little bit about the difference between a Fortune 500 company managing their own security versus a managed service provider that has outsourced security from their client? So what do the operations look like, and is the approach a little bit different there?
The approach is, that's a great question, Kim. So at the end of the day, the approach between a mom and pop shop, let's just say medium business, and large enterprise, whether that be big bank, state government, or what, at the end of the day, the way that that's mechanically, technologically, operationally, playbooky approached is exactly the same. The difference is that the medium-sized business cannot afford to have that SIM solution on-prem, nor can they afford the human resources to go around it. So what do? The Fortune 500 will have their own jet fleet, right? The medium business will buy into a jet, in a fractional type of way. Then that, gives them the ability to fly around, just like the Fortune 500 will. So it really comes down to a human resource thing. A lot of SIM as a service, and I don't want to mention them because I know this podcast is not about, products and so forth. But at the end of the day, the technology in the back end is largely the same, right? And in these as a service companies, they run it up in AWS or Azure, so you have infinite compute and storage and scalability and, kind of global presence. It's largely, ran on an elastic stack with Kibana and other technologies, whether you do it on-prem or do it as a service. But the big thing is, if you do it on-prem, man, you have to buy that software up front. You need to maintain it. You need the storage and compute behind it. Then you need the human resources, and then you need the playbook, and then you need 24/7, 365, because the SOC and the SIM is not Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, right? It's a 24/7, 365 thing. So, whether it's SOC or firewall or email or, endpoint, EDR or managed endpoint, disaster recovery, whatever it may be, for these small, medium, and sometimes large businesses, and here comes my theatrical kind of aggressive language before, they can't do it without managed services. I feel that strongly about it. I mean, I have my master's degree from an incredible security school, so I'm and I worked for that university system, so I'm kind of aware of, the students that graduate. They're fantastic, but they just can't graduate enough of them fast enough to keep up with the risk. And how I wish I could see a graph, because I think the risk is kind of outpacing the professionals that are graduating. And then, like a doctor, you should do a residency and have a few years under your belt to really kind of understand what's going on. And I think the risk and the pace of cybersecurity is really outpacing the professionals, if you will, that can actually care for that risk. So a ton of liability there. Okay, where do they differ? A managed service provider, remember I went through that whole list that they're going to do like a whole array of things as a service. I think things that an MSP will never do is be responsible for identities and the access control. So you have the authentication, authorization. I don't think they'll ever be responsible for that. And then they'll never be responsible for how that then ACLs out to data, because there's just too much responsibility on the MSP. And if you look at AWS or Azure or Google or whatever, and kind of their shared responsibility matrix, those three things that I mentioned are three things that those cloud providers will never care for, because there's just too much liability for the service provider.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's actually very interesting. So then, pretty much from an operational standpoint, right? Like if we've got a breach, SOP for enterprise versus a similar breach, SOP for an SMB, the only core distinction is the obviously lack of managed service provider actually maintaining and managing any identity-based or oriented impacts, but also outside of that, there's not really any difference, right? What they're going to do. If they are disconnecting a machine from a network, they're disconnecting a machine from a network. It's the way that they approach it, or the steps for remediation that they take are pretty much the same. Am I right in understanding that?
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, there are some differences, right? And let me give you kind of a real world example for this. Number one is like, if let's say I'm the customer and somebody is offering me SOC as a service, security as a service, incident response as a service, and there's some providers that kind of actually do all of those, so they have continuity of care and so forth. So when something bad happens to me, and they're probably watching my network 24/7, 365, but let's just say they're not, and I know something bad happens, and I need to like parachute people in, I have one number to call. Okay. How does that equate to the real world? Like if I get injured, like significantly injured, I have one number to call, right? What's the number, Cam?
911.
911, right? And what do? Okay. They kind of like categorize and classify the situation. Okay. It's serious. This guy's having a heart attack. And as a result of that, they can dispatch many different services, right? It might be fire department, it might be, poison control or whatever. It might be police. They might have to fly a helicopter in from a hospital or whatever, but that response is like totally managed. I make one call. I don't worry about the response. I've basically outsourced that to, city, county government, hospital, police, everybody else. If I'm a Fortune 500 doing it myself, right? Now we have to classify, and now who do I call? And I think the service that you guys provide is fantastic because you can help, automate that call tree and so forth. And when I worked for a big bank, I mean, seriously, there were people all over the globe that you needed to get on that call. And maybe it was just 6 people, right? And one is on vacation and the other one's on a different time zone or whatever. So how do you get the right people at the right place at the right time? And not too many people, because you don't want everybody to show up, because then it becomes, all muddled and whatnot. But then when you actually start responding, it's like, now you need to have the procedures and the playbooks and, the change control and the documentation, and then the postmortem takes place and all of this other stuff. So, I mean, to take this full circle, I mean, what's the difference kind of be, MSP and kind of do it yourself? Here you have one phone call and you rely on everybody else to respond. Here, you have a bunch of different people to call, and you have to, respond yourself and have the hardware and the software and the people and the processes and the procedures and all of that stuff in order to respond. So
yeah, that makes sense.
The big difference.
I think I'm kind of hearing, right, like the from an ingestion standpoint, when something is reported, when something is triggered, whatever it may be, that from an enterprise perspective, the onus of collaboration and consolidating the group of people actually responsible for being able to address this, as well as triaging it, is a little bit left in the air, right? It's a bit more disparate rather than with an MSP where things are a bit more coordinated because there exists that level of dispatch internally for that managed service provider.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is why I think your product is so important, because I mean, it does 100 different things, but I mean, that's one of the core components there. And as we do incident response, and again, it's not our bread and butter, we do a little bit of it, but who to contact, when to contact them, how to classify that incident is, man, if you can get off to a good start like that, I mean, you're doing great. Now, like a real world example, and I know I'm getting long-winded, but a real world example of that, I mean, the first question we ask is what stuff has changed in the last 20 years? So basically 20 years ago, we had 9/11, right? And I mean, a horrible situation. There's nothing that anybody could have really done to lessen the blow of that. But one of the things that I think we learned is that communication really broke down.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like you said.
Oops, sorry, Cam, I cut out there. I'll just.
Like you said.
I'll just rewind a little bit.
What you said at the top.
Yeah. So what?
The human
Go ahead, Robert. Yep.
Right. Back in the stories we heard in the postmortem about, the FBI did not. They got information in Minnesota about a guy that was learning to fly a plane, but he wasn't interested in landing. and that couldn't get up the chain to the right people, right? There are a lot of stories like that. Simple communication.
Oh, Robert, I mean, communication is everything. And as we started out, you said, look back 20 years and see how this thing evolved. And if we look at 9/11, and I mean, there's nothing we could have really done to lessen the blow there. But I think the lesson learned was how important communication was, because, was it the Coast Guard or the people that are on the Hudson, and then you got people on land, the ambulances, and then the fire department, and then the state wants to know what's going on, and the feds want to know what's going on. You got fire and EMS and and just, I mean, literally the radios and the channels and the telephones and whatever, I mean, just weren't working. And as a result of that, again, we couldn't lessen the blow, but as a result of that, I mean, it was difficult. And I think as a result of that, I think a bunch of reform happened to communication and call trees and, who do we reach out to and whatnot. And I think, Cam, bringing this back to the technology world and the fantastic product that you guys have, the tighter and cleaner and quicker that you have that contact information, just the better the whole experience goes.
Yeah, absolutely. So that kind of is a good segue into the next area that I want to cover and talk about a little bit, which is the notion of cross-functional teams in IT, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, before you'd have a dev team, you'd have an IT operations team, you have a security team. So over the past 15 years, we've seen the notion of DevOps come into play for rapid iteration, rapid development, and releases. Now we have the notion of DevSecOps, which also kind of consolidates some level of technical support as well as security teams. Now, I'm curious, does this notion of breaking down these individual walls between the different IT segments go back to making incident response more efficient just from a standpoint of communication?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the goal is, right, as we talk through everything today, is to try to avoid the incident, right? We want to prevent that thing. But let me give you a little bit of kind of actual background. So when I worked for Fortune 10 bank, it would have been 15 years ago. Again, I was kind of an infrastructure-y guy, me, really systems and whatnot. But I was on a security team with a lot of people, most of them developers. So I don't know if this is by accident or intentional, but me and other people that were more infrastructurist security, we sat amongst developers, and that was awesome. But what I learned right away, and this is not to be offensive or anything like that, this is just my experience, is that developers really knew development databases, language, and stuff like that. And then the infrastructure guys kind of knew, infrastructure, compute, storage, data, networking, blah, blah, blah. But the two shall never cross. I mean, it was like water and oil, and kind of putting the security guys, gals in the middle of the developers. There just is that kind of natural cross-pollination, if you will. And I thought that was fantastic. I mean, we become good friends, and you go to lunch and you hang out at night, and you work, and you learn a little bit about dev, and they learn a little bit about infrastructure. And I think that at the end of the day, I think that that's a beautiful thing. Now, cold hard, what do I think we should do? I think especially cloud and kind of infrastructure as code today. I think your old, 20-year-old in the industry people, infrastructure people, should learn how to code, or at least script, within object-oriented, type of language, or something like PowerShell or Python or whatever it may be. Then I think the developer folks, just to a really high degree, maybe 50,000 feet, should learn about infrastructure a little bit, so that, again, Cam, I mean, let's say it's not even a breach or something, but just an application has a problem, or something's up with the database, or some connection string can't connect. I mean, then people can get together and say, well, is it the connection string? Is it an identity certificate? Is it a network error? Is it a compute thing that's going on? And then dev and security work together to help resolve that problem even quicker. So yeah, man, any team up there, any tearing down of silos, I think it helps prevent, detect, and then respond to anything that's going on. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that, and obviously this isn't the case normally, but I will say that just from my own experience, I've noticed that in the case that teams are really siloed, even among some of our clients, that there's going to be finger pointing, right? A problem happens, right? It's not us, go check with them. It's not them, go check with us, right? And at that point, being able to break down that silo stops this little ping pong of where the problem ends up with the last message that was sent.
I've been on those calls, man. I mean, especially at big bank, and hey, that was a blessing. I had a fantastic experience. Just wish them, all the love in the world. But I was on a lot of like incident calls, like never a breach or anything, but it's like app is down or something's not working or whatnot, and you got like 25 people on the phone call and everybody a little bit of pointing of fingers and nobody knows what's going on and everybody's quiet on the phone call. And then all of a sudden the thing starts working. Right? So culture is everything, because you want to have a culture, not where everybody's quiet and somebody's doing something behind the scenes and all of a sudden it starts working. You want this culture of like, hey, we're all in it together. There's going to be no pointing of fingers. There's going to be like no judgment. Everybody just be honest. And, Bob or somebody's going to say, oh, you know what? I changed something last night. I thought I created a change control ticket. It must have broke this thing. Okay, now let's go in and, wind that thing back or whatever. So then maybe you have that outage fixed in like 15 or 20 minutes instead of like 2 hours or whatever. So just this culture of, and I had a professor like that too. He had spent some time in Japan studying, the whole, Toyota manufacturing framework, which lean came out of and whatnot. And he said they're much more interested in fixing the problem and as opposed to like pointing fingers. And that story has stuck with me for a long time. So yeah, it's all about culture, man.
Yeah, 100%. And then I guess the last thing that I want to leave our watchers with is what's next, right? So from a security standpoint for any organization, right, whether they're managing their own security, whether they are an outsourced SOC through an MSP, whatever it may look like, what is next? What do you foresee as kind of a process that might be standardized across security just as best practice? Or what do you think people will start to introduce just as a staple in order to make sure that security ops are ready for what the bad guys are coming up with next?
Yeah, absolutely. So give me like 3 or 4 minutes to answer this because it's really important. So let me hit on the future for like 3 or 4, just like 3 minutes, and then let me hit on what really matters. And I promise I'll do it quick because I've already mentioned some of this stuff. Okay, so what's the future? Identity is the control plane going forward, period, like full stop, right? Along with that, in combination with that, is this zero trust framework, right? So in the past, we kind of trusted and then verified. Now we don't trust anything, and we continuously verify. You kind of take this assumed breach too. We just assume somebody's going to make it by the firewall. We just assume that a credential is going to be stolen, right? So then we put MFA in place. We assume that the endpoint is going to get owned, right? So then we put app ring fencing in place and whatever else, so kind of this. So identity, zero trust, and assumed breach. That's for the next 20 years, right? Number 2, it's all about data. Okay, this is hyperbolic because you might have an IoT, you might have a plant, it might be the SCADA network. So this is a little bit hyperbolic, but it's all about data. Okay, the insurance companies, the CEO, the regulators, law enforcement doesn't really care about anything else. At the end of the day, it's about the data. Cloud, again, future prediction, cloud will continue to grow. I think even faster and faster and faster. I think as infrastructure becomes code, I think your infrastructure people need to learn how to script with object-oriented type of language. And then I also think this is kind of a future thing, and one of the 3 or 4 things that really matter is that, especially for small, medium, large businesses, they just cannot do it without help. A lot of times they're afraid to ask for help. I mean, I kind of get that. But the companies are understaffed. Their IT staff, there's fantastic people, super intelligent. There's just not enough of them to go around. They're wearing like 4 different hats, so you really can't zero in on 1 or 2 things and do it well. So anyway, not to get long-winded, those are the future things. Now, if I can have like 3 more minutes, I want to focus on like what really matters. Because as we do incident response and as we read statistics from insurance companies and like the Verizon DBIR, it like really boils down to like certain things. Okay, number 1, okay, 60-some% of incidents and breaches, and Microsoft just recently, I'm not kidding you, like a week ago, it's February 2022, they came out with a stat too that's even higher than like 60-some%. So just take the middle there somewhere. 70% of those things involve a stolen credential. Okay. But almost 100% of those incidences could be stopped with MFA. And that's why insurance companies are darn near mandating that folks have MFA in place today. Right. Because nobody understands risk better than insurance companies and casinos, right? So they know that if you put MFA in place, it reduces that risk. Okay, number 2, as we respond and read stats. So you get a credential, and then number 2 and 3 are actually tied. But number 2, you have a system that's not patched, or it's just flat out misconfigured. Right, so you have a log for J, you have an exchange vulnerability, you have, whatever is happening on the edge. Something hasn't been patched, and the patch has been out for like 6 months, and it's still not patched. Or you have a firewall with 3389 is still open, or 445, or whatever the heck it is, SMB, RDP, SSH, something like that. Firewall is just flat out misconfigured. It's quite often it. Okay. Number 3, email security, social engineering. I think we know enough about that, so I don't think I need to harp on that. Endpoint, got to have a strong endpoint. And then Cam, what we spent quite a bit of time talking about today is that you really need awareness of what's going on with all of your controls and put that stuff in context. So you really need some type of SIM, SOC. People are looking at it, 24/7. And it just can't be managed endpoint, because then you're missing the firewall logs, the VPN logs, the cloud logs, and you're missing the identity logs. So it just can't be managed endpoint. It's got to be the whole darn thing to make sense of what's going on and to do it fast enough. And then lastly, I would end with this. If you have, in a ransomware situation, if you have really robust backup and recovery in place, disaster recovery in place, if that's robust and you have a high degree of confidence that it will work, and you're also doing things like NAS snapshotting and things like that, we've had ransomware scenarios where we can recover that customer in 20 minutes to a half hour. If that stuff is not in place, or you have a fantastic backup solution and you've just neglected it from an operational point of view, then it can go several days. And that's just not good for anybody. So sorry, Cam, that's kind of a long-winded answer, but I just wanted to make sure to get that out to your audience there today, because there are 4 or 5 things right there that folks can focus on. And it's not the bright, shiny, blinky things. And a lot of times there's not a lot of expense to those, but those things are what we continuously see. That's what the statisticians continuously see. And those are the things that really make a difference at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that you're 100% right with respect to even what I see with some of our clients where, yeah, we've got endpoint detection and endpoint monitoring, but then nothing in place for backups, right? Or potentially even from an identifying an incident perspective, the holistic logs paint a picture. If you've just got endpoint in place or one piece of this puzzle, at that point, you can see a small fraction of it, but you don't really know what led to the vulnerability, or you don't have a complete picture as far as where this originated. So I completely agree. I think that from that standpoint, security should be taken from a more comprehensive approach there.
Yeah, I mean, I had a professor, and she did like true forensics as kind of a secondary job. So she's gathering evidence, and she's taking hashes of it and so forth. And so she can submit that in a court of law. So I mean, like the real deal forensics professional. And she said when she goes into an organization that's had something happen, the first thing that she asks for is logs. Right. you really need to have that SIM solution to really kind of make sense of what's going on. And then, like you said, Cam, kind of contextualize it and put a timeline behind it. And, then you kind of, have a kill chain or the path that the thing took. But yeah, that always stuck with me, that she said the first thing that she looks for is like a SIM solution or some type of aggregated log solution. Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Well, Dean, really, really appreciate you coming on. I know that I learned a bunch, and I'm fairly confident that our viewers will have a whole new perspective of cybersecurity, and hopefully we can help some people out. So thank you so much for being on today.
All right. Thanks, Cam. Thanks, Bob.
Thanks, Dean. Great having you.